Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to our weekly coverage of the 2020 presidential election. And not much has really changed since last week. As a matter of fact, my model has gotten a little bit closer to where I actually think the presidential race stands at the moment. The only difference in terms of state winner is Pennsylvania, where I have, you know, personally I have Biden having a small advantage there, but not enough to call it a lean. So, I tilt Pennsylvania towards Biden. But what I want to talk a little bit about today is actually similarities between states. So, this is what the model looks like. And of course, if you want the polling average, there it is. Yippee. Okay. So, I'm actually going to go ahead and clear the map and talk about similarities between certain swing states and just certain states as a whole. For example, these states tend to be more about convincing voters that you are a moderate. And whoever's best able to do that is going to win that state. For example, in 2016, well, this was what the result was. So Donald Trump was better prepared to present himself as a moderate and better able to do so in the Rust Belt and Upper Midwest. And I'm wondering if that's going to change with Biden being in the presidential race, right? And that's because there's a decent amount of swing voters in these states. Now, the other reason is the voters in each party are a little less partisan than and a lot less, conservative or a lot less liberal than they are in other parts of the nation, right? So if we take that and go to a different region, which is the South, and I'm including Texas in this, though Texas is also going to get included in the North. I'm also including Missouri, and I could historically include Delaware, Maryland, and D.C., but I'm going to actually put those in the Mid-Atlantic states because culturally these days they fit in a lot more with those states. The reason why I'm putting Missouri in there is about half of the state is very southern. And honestly, I could talk about something similar in the eastern part of Oklahoma. But Oklahoma is kind of Great Plains. Texas is Southwest and Great Plains and South and Gulf Coast, and it's really its own thing. So I'll leave Texas out for right now, but just be aware that I do consider Texas a southern state. But, and I may as well throw Missouri into the Great Plains as well when we get there. And I'll also be including Iowa and Minnesota as well. But anyway, so the South is predominantly based off of turnout, and your goal is to turn out your base and prevent your opponent from turning out their base. And realistically, and that's because there are very few swing voters in southern states, and there is a correlation between race and which party you're going to vote for in the South. And this is true regardless of education level. It's becoming less of a correlation, at least amongst college-educated white people, but in general in the South, if you're white, you vote Republican. If you're black, or Hispanic, you're voting Democratic. So that's why you have Virginia, which has a more balanced racial demographic, but as well as a few more swing voters, hence and Nova, as well as a lot more urban areas and a much higher percentage of college educated whites than in other southern states. That's why Virginia tends to be slightly blue these days, and it's moving slowly towards the Democrats because more and more Virginians are becoming college educated. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that college educated whites are becoming less of a Republican demographic. That said, whites without a college education are becoming much more Republican, and there's still a lot of them in all of these southern states, but even in Virginia. That's why North Carolina is a slight Republican advantage. That's why Georgia has slightly more of a Republican lean. It's why South Carolina has, it's actually why Florida has a slight Republican lean too, except Florida has a lot of transplants from the north. But you draw a line from about Tampa to about, I think this is Orlando. I don't know my Florida geography very well. But about here, you draw a line right here, and Florida is a southern state from that point on up. From here, it actually has a lot more in common with certain parts of New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Basically, the old voters, the people who were voting for H.W. Bush and Reagan in the 80s and 90s. When they retired, they went down to Florida, and specifically South Florida and Miami, and now they vote Republican. But they don't vote for, say, the same type of Republican that a Mississippi or an Alabama would. It's why they like the Bushes so much. But you go to North Florida, and especially the Panhandle, and there's a reason why we'll call, a lot of people call this part Lower Alabama. It's very similar to Alabama. Jacksonville is a Republican stronghold to an extent, though whether or not you think it's moving towards the Democrats or actually becoming more Republican, that's up for debate, believe it or not. But that's why these states are all swing states, is because, there's enough Democratic voters that they can actually make some inroad, they can actually make elections look competitive. Even if, say, in Georgia, the Republicans' floor is 48% of the vote, unless they just can't turn anyone out. But even then, like I said, their floor is basically 48% of the vote. The Democrats' floor is about 43. North Carolina, it's a little bit more even, probably 46 for the Republicans, 45 for the Democrats, something like that. Virginia, it's basically flipped, and we're talking about, Democrats at a floor of 46 or 47, Republicans at 45. That's really what the difference is between these states, and it takes a monumental lift in order to flip any of them. It's why North Carolina was so, flipped in 2008, was it took the Democrats winning by 7 nationally in order to do it, and the truth is that it hasn't changed that much since then. I believe North Carolina's final margin of victory was like 4%, and Hillary won by almost 3%. So, yeah, it would take a 7-point win nationally for the Democrats in order to flip North Carolina. Just because there is not a lot of elasticity in these states when it comes to their voting populations, whereas in the Midwest, there is. And Illinois, well, they've got Cook County, which kind of makes it its own thing, right? Right, so let's move on to, let's move to Texas. Let's talk about Texas. There's a reason why it's no longer the super safe red state that it used to be, and that's because its population is growing. And of course, as more people move in, typically it's going to get more urban, and urban populations tend to vote Democratic. But Texas has an extremely large rural population. In addition, they're like a lot of southern states where race tends to correlate with how you vote. But Texas also has its own dynamic going on because Texas is just its own state. And a lot of people are, and a lot of Democrats are moving in from, say, California specifically. They're moving to Texas for low taxes, cheap land. It's, all of that stuff. And they're trying to get people who have California-style politics elected in Texas now, which I find absolutely hilarious. They're fleeing California because of high taxes, high cost of living, restrictive laws on everything, and then they're voting for the same types of people who gave them California in the first place and made them flee. I think it's absolutely ridiculous, but, yeah. So, the other thing about Texas is that it's the same thing as the South, where the shifts aren't happening fast enough for it to be a state that could flip until maybe 2028. I'd say 2032, given 2028, I think is a reasonable year for it to actually vote blue. In terms of how quickly it's shifting. We're not talking a lot of shift long term, right? So let's talk a little bit about the Southwest, and I'm just going to highlight it in red just because it's easier for me to do that because it's a brighter color. And I'm including Texas because part of Texas is in the Southwest. We can't deny that. And just like part of Texas is in, the South. So the thing about the Southwest is there's, again, a lot of swing voters. But it's also really weird in that they've got their own quirky form of politics. In Utah, you have to win the Mormon vote if you want to win the state. And they always have slightly quirky candidates coming from these states. I mean, do I need to mention Gary Johnson from New Mexico? Way back in the old days, Barry Goldwater was considered a bit quirky. Nowadays, he's a standard conservative, but, Mike Lee from Utah would be a good example. So these states are just, while there are a lot of swing voters, there's also high partisanship. So you not only have to portray yourself as somewhat moderate, but you also have to you also have to turn out your base. In addition, there is a high Hispanic population in all of these states. So you also, and it's high enough that you actually do need to make appeals to them in order to have any chance of carrying these states. Nevada is slightly different because there's a lot of not college-educated whites as well, working-class white voters that could help you flip the state if you can galvanize them. But you still need Hispanic voters, and that's also true in Florida, and of course it's also true in Texas. But Arizona and Texas are very similar in that their Hispanic populations tend to be more conservative for various reasons. Texas, it's because they've been there since, forever, and a lot of Hispanics are descended from Tejanos, who fought with the Texians in the Texas Revolution and have been there for a long time. They've considered themselves Americans for a long time. They really, and a lot of them even see themselves as just white. And that's another interesting political phenomenon I may talk about at some point in the future, is that over time, Hispanic populations, the longer their families are in the United States, the more likely it is they're going to consider themselves white. And when they consider themselves white, they tend to actually vote Republican. And of course, that's also true. The longer a Hispanic family is in the United States, the more likely it is they will vote Republican, because the longer they're here, they tend to see things, I don't know, they just tend to think of themselves more as part of the general American culture, and they tend to take up, quote, American values of freedom, independence, and I think those are just human, values, but, it is an interesting trend I've noticed. It's, again, becoming less and less of a thing, but, part of that's identity politics taking root, and, of course, basically the more Hispanics there are in a state, the more it's going to vote red, with Utah being a bit of an exception because of the high Mormon vote in Utah. But yeah, this is basically where the this is where the Southwest kind of stands. Now, we're going to take out a few of these states, and I'm going to put up the Great Plains now. And actually, part of the Great Plains, you can make the argument that there's parts of Arkansas that are Great Plains, or parts of New Mexico that are Great Plains. New Mexico has a better argument than Arkansas, but, the Great Plains kind of does this thing. So, the best way to appeal to the Great Plains is to make yourself out to be a friend of farming, farmers, and their values. And of course, farmers tend to be a little bit more isolated. They tend to be more rural. They tend to value firearms, and these days people are valuing firearms a lot more. And if you're a first-time gun buyer, seriously practice, learn how to operate clean and, all that with your firearm. But and that's also true in the South, that people value their firearms. But in the Great Plains, that's a thing. But they like farm subsidies. They like low tariffs so that they can purchase goods at a cheaper rate. And they, in general, like they like meat and potatoes, and they need their trucks, and they need oil. Especially in Texas, and of course in these Mountain West states as well. And we'll talk about the Mountain West in its own thing, because guess what? Most of the Southwest counts as Mountain West too. Now, of course, Minnesota has its Rust Belt, Upper Midwest thing going on. Iowa has its own Rust Belt, Upper Midwest thing going on. Missouri has its South thing going on, as well as a little bit of Midwest thing going on. Texas has, Southwest, South, Great Plains, Gulf Coast. It has Texas things going on. And Texas is Texas first and foremost. So now we're actually going to move to the Mountain West. And I'm really just going to include, and honestly you could even include Washington and Oregon to its own extent in the Mountain West, as well as Arizona. New Mexico a little bit less so. California as well. You could make the argument that California could have parts that are considered Mountain West, but I'm going to leave Washington and Oregon off. When I talk about the Mountain West, I'm typically referring to these states. And really, the only ones that are competitive are the Southwest states, and that's because their own dynamics are because of the Southwest nature. For Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, they're basically safe Republican, though a Democrat can win statewide office or even a Senate seat. Look at Steve Bullock and John Tester for great examples of this. And that's because they also will vote for a candidate who better represents them on local issues in the governor's seats. And that's true all over. I'll get to New England in a little bit. But, they tend to vote for people who will represent their values, social conservatism for the most part. Again, Southwest is different. So I'll take out the Southwest states just to highlight this. Social conservatives and those who believe in some level of fiscal responsibility. They don't hate, they'll like farm subsidies, but they're fairly independent thinkers and they can do their own thing at their own time. Just depends on the day. So let's talk about the Pacific Coast now, and I'm actually going to throw Hawaii in there, but I won't throw Alaska in there. Hawaii is its own thing. It's an island state, and it has its own quirks because it's an island. It has a large non-white population. Again, tends to correlate with voting Democratic in general. And they tend to be a little bit more, progressive anyway. And all three of these states actually share this, or all four of these states actually share this. You look at the Bay Area, you look at Portland, Oregon, you look at Seattle, Everett, and Tacoma, Washington, and they're all fairly progressive. But then you go find certain areas that aren't. For example, outside of the coast, NorCal is pretty conservative. They actually have a lot more in common with rural Idaho than they do with the Bay Area. Similar thing with Oregon. Once you cross, and Washington too. Once you cross the Cascades, it's deep Republican country. And it's just very interesting to look at that dynamic, is that once you cross the Cascade Mountains, you're talking about a very Republican area and getting into the Sierra Nevada and all that. But again, that's mostly a rural-urban divide. Alaska is its own really interesting thing. It's extremely, extremely sparsely populated. You've got a few cities, which weirdly, it's one of the few areas where the areas with the lower population density tend to vote Democratic, and the higher population densities tend to vote Republican. Juneau being its own thing. Anchorage being its own thing to an extent, Fairbanks, but you look at the voting districts and how they voted, and it tends to be that Juneau, I think I mentioned Juneau, but it's just really, it's an interesting state, and part of that has to do with the rather large Inuit / Native American population in the state. But like I said, it is its own thing. So let's go up to the Mid-Atlantic states, including D.C., which for the most part, I don't want to include Connecticut or Rhode Island. I'm including Pennsylvania just to make it easy, because Pennsylvania was historically considered Mid-Atlantic, even though nowadays we consider it Rust Belt or even Midwestern in some respects. But this area tends to, outside of Pennsylvania, vote heavily blue. Delaware is changing, and I think it's actually becoming more competitive. And part of that's just because there's a ton of large cities. Pennsylvania used to vote blue because of Philadelphia. Philadelphia just can't outvote the rest of the state anymore. New Jersey, of course, has Newark, Hoboken, Atlantic City, Philly suburbs, etc. New York City suburbs. New York, of course, has NYC, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany. Maryland has Baltimore and parts of D.C., at least D.C. burbs. Delaware has Wilmington, which is a Philly suburb in some respects, but it has Wilmington, which is its own city. But these states are basically all about, can the urban areas and their blue-leaning suburbs, and their urban-leaning suburbs outvote the exurban and rural areas of the state. And that's becoming less true in states like Pennsylvania and Delaware. DC is all urban, so there's no exurban or rural area to talk about. It's becoming less true in Delaware, and it's certainly not true in Pennsylvania anymore. But it's still vastly true in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. So now we move on to our final region, which is New England. Which, shout out to any Massachusetts viewers, or any New England viewers in general. And these states are basically typified by the fact that they have fairly high, actually in some cases, extremely elastic populations. They have a lot of swing voters up here. However, the Democratic Party has a massive advantage in party registration in most of these states. Maine, New Hampshire, exceptions. But here, your goal is to convince independent voters that you are the most similar to them, politically speaking. And the Republicans tend to be liberal on a lot of social issues and a lot of cultural issues, whereas they are still, fiscally very hawkish. So they like balanced budgets, they like low taxes to an extent, but they have to keep them somewhat high to please the state legislatures and all that. It's why, for example, we have a situation where Massachusetts and Vermont, two of the bluest states in the United States, have Republican governors who are extremely popular. And Connecticut I actually thought they were going to have a Republican governor before the results of the 2018 midterm elections came in. But for the most part, this area has a reputation for voting blue. The Maine's 2nd congressional district and New Hampshire certainly have chances, and even Maine at large has a chance of voting red in a general election. I mean, you've got Suzanne Collins up in Maine as a senator, a very long-serving senator from that state. Two states, Maine and Vermont, have independent senators, Bernie Sanders and Angus King, for example, Massachusetts had Scott Brown as a senator for a little bit after a special election, but he didn't hold the seat. That seat is now occupied by Elizabeth Warren, but it was a somewhat competitive election. But, New England is its own thing. Anyway, I want to thank all y'all for watching and humoring me. Take it easy. Have a nice day. And if you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions really do help. And I genuinely appreciate each and every one of y'all. We just passed 365 subscribers, so one for each day of the year, and I greatly appreciate that. Though I'm at 367, if I remember correctly. So that means we even got over 366 for a leap year. I'd love to see if we could hit 400 by, I don't know when, but, hit 400 by May, but we'll see. As always, take it easy. Have a nice day. I'll see you next time. Bye.